Well, let's get into things. So today we will be deep diving into some of the findings from our 2023 M365 and Microsoft Teams benchmarking report. We think we have some pretty interesting things to share. I'm thinking some of the findings, if you sort of compare them to your own collaboration habits in your own organizations, I think some of the findings might shock you a little bit. Some of you maybe have already read the report, and for that, thank you. But today is just a really great opportunity to meet with our report authors, also meet with some of the top performers that were identified as a part of our benchmarking study. And usually for these sessions as well, if you'd like to interact in the chat, please do jump in. If you'd like to raise your hand and ask any questions as we go through, please feel free to. So any questions that you have, any comments, please keep it interactive throughout. And thank you again for joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're hosting today's session, and also the traditional custodians of the lands where all of our participants are located today. I am from the central coast of New South Wales, so I would like to acknowledge the Darkinjung people, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And perhaps if you want to jump in and just introduce yourselves in the chat as well, say hi, where are you joining us from? And for today's session as well, we'll be asking you a few questions to get started, to get you warmed up and to have you reflect a little bit about your own collaboration habits and the way that you're currently working, or perhaps you can reflect on the ways that your teams are currently working as well. Then I'll be introducing Laurie, who is SWOOP's Chief Data Scientist, and Laurie will be walking through all of the key findings from this year's report. We'll also be doing a nice little presentation to our top performers who are identified as a part of the benchmarking study. And then we'll be having a chat later as well with Michael Cashin from Engaged Squared. And Michael is actually a part of one of the top performing teams as a part of the study. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But as I mentioned, please do ask questions throughout. We're here to answer them. Good opportunity to have a chat and to collaborate. I should have also probably introduced myself earlier too, but hi, my name's Emily. If I haven't met you before, I work with SWOOP and I look after customer success for the APAC region. I'm also joined by Dr. Lawrence Lockley, who's our co-founder and chief data scientist. We have Michael Cashin here joining us as well from Engaged Squared. And then Sharon Dawson, who is our director for external relations and comms. And Sharon writes all of the great case studies that you'll find on the SWOOP website. So if you're ever looking for a bit of inspiration on how to run more effective collaboration platforms, whether it be Teams across M365, if you're looking at Viva Engage, if you're looking at Workplace, you'll find a heap of great resources on the website, and Sharon's sort of the brains behind a lot of the stories and things that we share there as well. So if I could just get you all to grab your nearest device, if you just want to use the QR code there on the screen, that will take you through to a quick audience poll. And we have some really simple questions for you. We're not requiring you to think too much, but more so just to reflect on your own habits and the way that you work. So I'll give you all just a few moments to jump in, use that QR code, or alternatively, you can also head to menti.com just in a browser, and then there's a code there that you can use on the screen. So I'll just give you another few seconds to jump in. And when I do move across to the Menti screen, you can also see the code on that screen. So I'm going to navigate over there now. I hope I'll be able to see a few of you over there. Okay, so the first question that we're wanting to ask you is, how many hours do you spend in online meetings per day? Well, I guess unfortunately for a lot of you, there are very few that are spending, 0 to 1 hour in meetings. So I feel very sorry for a lot of you. There's some quite high numbers there. But I think as well, if we're reflecting on these results, I think we'll be able to get into a little bit of myth busting as well today as we go through some of the findings and how this is actually being reflected across the broader sample size that we've looked at for our M365 and Teams benchmarking. So majority of you there seem to be sitting somewhere between the 1 to 3 hours. but there are definitely some people, if you are looking at this, on average every day, somewhere between 3, 4, or even over 4 hours of meetings every day. So we'll get into some interesting findings around that in just a moment. Thanks for participating. Next question. How many hours a day do you spend in email? So just think about a typical day. How often or how much time are you spending just sending and reading email? Oof, we got a few there for over 3 hours. Okay, these ones are majority of you reflected in the 0 to 1 hours, which sounds pretty good. I'm happy for those people. The next question that we'll be asking might maybe validate why why there's probably a little bit less time spent in email as well. So I'll jump through to that last question. Do you use Microsoft Teams channels daily to collaborate? Are you a channels user or are you not? Or maybe you're a little bit of a channels user, but you're not quite.
Well, these are impressive results, Emily.
Yeah. And I think as well, given the group of people we're talking to, I'm sure a lot of you would agree where we're coming from. And you probably have already implemented these habits either for yourself, yes, of course, but we need to think of the audience that we've got here. But we're thinking outside of out of the teams that you're working in, we expect, and we have the data to back up, why these habits could look wildly different for other parts of your organization. So a good moment to stop and reflect. But what I'll do now is I'll jump back into our content for the day. And from here, I'm going to hand over to Laurie to reveal the key findings from the report. So over to you, Laurie.
Okay, thank you, Emily. So in terms of benchmarking, of those that you aren't familiar about how we do benchmarking, we don't run surveys. We actually look at what everybody who is active on M365 and Teams is doing over the past 6 months, or for Teams, 3 months. So we had something like 266,000 employees, which included guests, I might say, across 19 organisations for M365. And for the teams, we really drill into the channels in particular, 67,000 teams across 17 organisations. So a pretty big sample, a little bigger than last year, but as I said, we look at everybody. So this isn't a sampling exercise, this is looking at what everybody does. So we just go to the next slide, Emily. So this is the myth busting, right? So commonly what we're hearing is that everybody is totally overwhelmed with too many meetings, resulting in burnout, low performance. We're declaring that a myth. And the reason we're declaring it a myth is that we think that those that are in this space of overload is actually incredibly small. Even though we feel terribly empathetic to you, and some of you are on this call, when we look across the whole population, it's a very small number. And it probably tells us in the next slide, I think, Emily. So only 1% of employers have, we believe, have meeting overload. Let's say, and we're saying it's 5 or more Microsoft Teams meetings each day. So 1%. Some of you on this call are in that 1%. Less than 17% have more than 2 meetings a day on Teams. Right? So it's a very small number that are really tied up in meetings. And I know a lot of you on this call are in that situation, but when we look across the whole population, you are a very small percentage. Now, the issue with running with this narrative is that organisations will typically then service those overloaded people, which they should indeed. But what in fact they're doing is ignoring the other 85 to 90% who are basically probably not meeting enough. Right, so let's just go to the next slide, Emily. Now, we got some interesting validation to this from an unexpected source, I might say, and I guess many of you on this call have probably read the latest work trends report from Microsoft. It was called "Will AI Fix Work?" This isn't necessarily, when you think about AI, remember AI isn't also surveying people. It's actually looking at what people do in some detail, if you like. So, but nevertheless, what the report had said, and here's some quotes here, the survey part of the report said the #1 productivity disruptor is inefficient meetings. And too many meetings was number 3. So this is the survey data telling us. The workplace analytics data from Viva Insights is telling us the heaviest meeting users, the top 25%, spend 7.5 hours a week in meetings. That's 1.5 hours per day, right? Most of you are actually claiming to have spent more than that. When I looked at the same data in the data set that we have, the number was 1.6 hours, right? So in essence, the workplace analytics results are telling us something quite different to what the surveys are telling us. So we can move to the next slide, Emily. And what we see with this chart is that 83% of staff have less than 2 meetings a day, right? So, and only a few of you on this, and some of you on this call are in that group. But what about the other? What about that group? You know, what are they doing? You know, they're what we're calling the sort of silent majority, and they're largely ignored, right? Now, when we looked at the data, I made sure that I only included people that at least had one online meeting in the period that we studied, right? So this isn't frontline staff that never go onto M365. These are people that have been active on M365, had at least one online meeting, and this is what the data is telling us. So I think it's something that, you know, and this is why we're declaring that we're in too many meetings a myth. Okay, so let's get on to the next insight. Number 2, have our habits changed? Well, I think people on this call, your habits have changed they probably changed pre-COVID. But in essence, you know, when we look at what people are doing, the majority of them are still sadly using email and even using email internally. We did see that people were getting better at having online meetings. So some of the online meeting habits around sharing your screen and having your camera turned on, that was getting a little bit better. And in fact, the use of SharePoint was getting a little bit better. But in essence, most people were still stuck in email and chat. If we go to the next slide, Emily. So 80 minutes a day on average reading emails, you know, so it's a lot, you know. And when we actually, for our actual benchmarking for the habits, we only look at the email you sent, right? But when we look at the time you spend in email, we also estimate, you know, how much time you've spent reading emails as well, right? Now, the other things that I guess concerned me a bit was that 76% of the people hadn't posted in a Teams channel to collaborate. Right now, this audience, it was probably like 90% that had posted. This is 76% of people hadn't posted in a channel. 71% hadn't posted in a Viva Engage community. They may have read. This is active participation. And in fact, 25% of the sample are not even sent or received a chat message. So they're really digitally inactive. And that's a concern when we look at the size of the numbers. In terms of our ROI calculation, you'll see that the methodology in the report, but largely what we're saying, if we adopted the habits that many of you on this call and certainly our benchmark leader organisations have demonstrated, then that's the equivalent of having a 4.5% increase in headcount in your organisation. So that's a substantial number, and that's a conservative number because we only looked at things we could measure. Okay,
Laurie,
next one.
Laurie, can I butt in and can we go back to just talking about meetings? We've got a few questions in here.
Sure.
Jody asked the question that some companies like theirs, they have Zoom as well as team meetings.
Yes.
Does this affect the data? Now, I believe you're right that you in M365 calendar, you can look at both meetings. Can you just explain how it's going to work if it's not just Teams meetings?
If an organisation is using Teams, then the time in meetings would be impacted. But we're fairly, and we recognise that some organisations, people are using both Teams and Zoom. But the ones we included largely had committed to M365. There may have been some backroom Zoom users, but largely that I think that they are actually using Teams meetings. But I can't say absolutely for sure. The other thing is if you scheduled your meeting, even a Zoom meeting in your Outlook calendar, we would probably pick that up as a number of meetings type thing. But there is some grey areas there. But I think, you know, the fact that the data has also been validated by Microsoft, we feel that, you know, last year we felt probably less comfortable and therefore we didn't wave our arms around quite as much. But this year, given the extra validation we've got, we think, you know, it's actually real numbers now. So
and Laurie,
anything else, Sharon?
Another one on that from Romany. Does that include calls? So I guess, are you talking, Romany, just about?
It includes calls, Roman. It includes everything I could think I could include, actually. So
yeah,
calls,
so it's not
could
just
be one-on-one
scheduled
calls. It could be one-on-one calls, ad hoc recording, scheduled calls. You know, the whole lot. You know, so you know, I was trying to bend over backwards to include all the sorts of things that were there, and that was the numbers that we came up with. So yeah, everything. Okay, so where are we? Next slide, Emily. So third insight, sort of, now this is getting to the core of collaboration, because when we collaborate, it's not just about you, it's about the people that you work with and the groups that you work with. And if you think about the groups you work with, everybody, in terms of groups in your Active Directory, typically those groups are your organizational hierarchy, right? So generally you're only a member of one group, but then of course we've got teams where you can be a member of multiple groups. The particular analysis we did in the report around groups, and that we'll follow up here, was your Active Directory grouping. So we looked at, you know, how are you collaborating, because we looked at your habits. There's 7 habits. Those of you that aren't familiar with the habits, there's things like email liberation. This is really balancing your email against your asynchronous discussions in channels or in Viva Engage. We also looked at the chat balance. We looked at meetings, when you meet synchronously versus the asynchronous channels. We looked at things like, you know, sharing your screen, turning the camera on, using Viva Engage versus Teams, and also using SharePoint versus on OneDrive. Right. So generally those habits are either a ratio of proportion. So we're not saying you shouldn't use one or the other, but we're saying that you should have an appropriate balance of them. So everybody that is active gets a collaboration score, and then we can average those scores within the group to define what the actual average for the group is. And then at this time, we also looked at, or last year, we looked at the variation within the groups. Now, the variation within the groups is important because, as you can imagine, that if you're in a group where even if a single member decides that they're only going to work in email, that means everybody else is either going to work in email or they're going to have to do double work for that person. And we certainly heard anecdotes around that sort of thing happening. So we looked at, as I said, we looked at the variance in collaboration habits across the groups. And I think the next slide, and so what we found was that only about 5% of those groups had both strong sort of performance, you know, as a group and as individuals, of course. The remaining 95% had some way to go to get members all on the same page in terms of how they worked. And then when we looked at, I think this is, looking at the chat versus channels, we also found that there was quite a confusion about, you know, what is chat and what is channels and what should I be using. So as I said, most people went for the chat because it goes with the meetings. 241 million Teams chat messages and less than 1 million Teams channel messages, so 240 to 1. So that's a big ratio. Now, I expect that you will have more chat messages and channel messages, but the ratio I think is way out of kilter. And we demonstrate that actually when we look at our best practice organisations. It's nothing like that. Okay, so let's have a look at this infamous and famous boomerang curve that we first launched last year. This year, same pattern, more data. So it's just denser. You can see, just to explain it, sort of the vertical axis is the average score for the group, and the horizontal axis is the variation within the group. All right. So now just to give you a little bit of an anecdote as to how you think about a group and getting all members on the same page. I can recall reading Eli Goldratt's Goal, a book about theory of constraints, and I remember an anecdote that he quoted in the book about being a scout leader with his son, taking a group of scouts on a hike where they all had to get to a certain position as quickly as possible. And of course, what you'd expect with a bunch of boys, there's some boys that run out the front and want to get there first, and then you've got kids that just want to dawdle at the back. And he found it was nearly impossible to sort of control this group, because the longer it went, the further apart they got, and that meant the later they're going to be to get to their destination. The next time he did it, he thought about it, and the theory of constraints, he said the biggest constraint was the people at the back. Right, so think about your digital team. The biggest constraint is the people that are still stuck in email or something like that and refuse to use some of the more modern techniques. What he did was he put the slow kids at the front, right, and said, you fast kids, you've got to stay behind the slow kid. Right, so the slow kids, of course, are now leaders, so they feel some responsibility. The fast kids are pushing the kids that are at the front, because they want to move along. And in fact, the result is they all got there faster. So if you think about your digital team like that, it's a little bit like that. You've got people that are going to be laggards, and you're going to people who are going to be leaders. What this boomerang chart shows, that those in the bottom left actually have low variance because they're all bad, in fact. A little bit of an anecdote for that little toe that's a little bit higher, around the 0.3 mark. What we found was that when we looked at it this year, it was there last year as well, was that it showed that some groups were very good with the Teams thing, with the meetings things, like the screen on, the camera on. And they're also pretty good with SharePoint, but they're actually absolutely terrible at the other four habits. So that was that little toe, if you like, at the 0.3. The ones at the bottom were universally bad, so the ones at the very top, in fact, the elite, they were teams that on average scored very high and very little variance, as you'd expect, because they're all good. And you can see that's a thinner group, if you like, at the top. Most of the data, I guess, is sitting there towards the turning point, where we think there's sort of a critical mass. So when you get a bit of a critical mass in your group with certain patterns, generally expect that people will start to follow, and things will start getting better. So what we're doing now is actually, with some of our custom benchmarking, is showing company groups with different colors on this boomerang chart, which is all the data, and you'll get a sense of how mature you are based on that. And we've seen some interesting results from that. So we better move on, Emily, because we're probably running a bit late. So I guess the recommendation out of here is collaboration isn't about how your personal habits alone are, but how they're impacted with the people you work with on a day-to-day basis. So have a look at how your day-to-day groups are working and the habits within those groups. Let's just move on, because we're running a bit late now. But the fourth insight, I think, is a good news insight. So basically, up to now, I guess I've been a bit critical about the balance, the use of the different modes of collaboration. But in essence, if we look across the activity levels overall, the activity level for collaboration on M365 and in Teams has actually increased significantly, despite the fact that in the last 6 months, we've seen a bigger back to the office, more face-to-face. In fact, what we've seen is that the face-to-face is actually generating more activity, digital activity, rather than replacing it. And I think that's a good thing. That's sort of saying, when we do meet face-to-face, we actually do get more interactive. And then when we go home, or back working remotely, we're actually more active online as well. We also saw more use of SharePoint files, which is great. So if it's in SharePoint, then it's shareable. We know that. And also looking at the teams in particular, these are the sort of teams that are using channels. That 67,000 teams we looked at. When we looked at our leading organisations, we found that, and those leaders, including people like Engage Square that we have on the call today, their job is teaching organisations how to collaborate on the digital platforms. 71% of their teams were classified as self-directed, and we use some AI machine learning techniques to classify team behaviour based on the interaction patterns. And the self-directed pattern, where everybody is pretty much interacting with everybody else, is our aspirational one. And it's good to see that they're actually servicing with our high performers. So I think is that the last slide that I've got? Yeah, I think that's my last slide. So I think I'm pretty much just about on time. So it's over to you, Sharon, isn't it?
Well, speaking of those high performers, these were our collaboration champions. So the high performing teams in the benchmarking from both our M365 benchmarking and Microsoft Teams benchmarking. So congratulations to all these organizations. And in the report, you'll see case studies from all of these organizations. What's really interesting, so when Laurie crunches all the numbers, we actually, all our benchmarking is anonymous, so we know which organization has which results, but we only see ID numbers. So then we go to these high performing organizations and we say, we've got these ID numbers, can you tell us what teams they are, what departments they are? And that's actually how we uncover these stories. What's really interesting is often our contacts at these organisations have never heard of these teams. And in fact, Michael from Engage Squared that we're about to speak with, his CEO, Stephen Monk, couldn't even see into your team. I don't know whether you know that, Michael, but he was telling us, he had no access to your team even. And it was actually ranked number 2 out of all the team, the 67,000 that we benchmarked. So what was really interesting this time is when we did go to talk to all of these collaboration champions, there was one common trait amongst all of the teams and departments in both M365 and Microsoft Teams. So without exception, all of these teams or departments that made the decision to work in the same way on their digital platform. So typically working in the same way was working out loud in Microsoft Teams channels, not in chat. And then sharing files in the channels via SharePoint, always turning on their cameras during meetings, never using email for internal communications. I'm sure, Michael, I would imagine at Engage Squared, you guys wouldn't use email for internal comms. It's only for external comms. And it's also about working asynchronously in Teams channels. So, as I said, a lot of these champions were surprised by their success. You'll see there Virgin Media O2. So that's the UK's biggest telco. There was a merger last year between Virgin Media and O2, and their top performing team, they were so surprised when we reached out to them. They said, you must have the wrong team here because we're not doing anything special. This is how we work every day. What's really interesting, even though it's a natural way of working for them, our data found only 24% of employees work collaboratively in any sort of way on Microsoft Teams channels. And even just following the chat in this conversation, that probably sounds about right. And then we found only 5% of teams or departments that we analysed in M365 have strong and consistent collaboration habits. So that's 95%. Of those teams and departments pretty much work in different ways. So there's a big room for improvement there. So in our Microsoft Teams benchmarking, ranked at number 2 was our Engage Squared team from Japan, the one that I was saying that the CEO didn't even have access to. So with us today, we've got Michael Cashin, who's the Japan country manager from Engage Squared. And Michael, I guess we might just have a chat about this particular team. So the team that benchmarked so highly was for a particular project, and it was a pretty tricky project. So Michael, I might hand over to you if you can explain to us about the project, what you were tasked to do, and then if you could walk us step by step about, how do you start a team, how do you work this way, and what it actually looks like for people who want to start working collaboratively in Microsoft Teams.
Sure. Thank you for having me today. I'm Michael Cashin. I'm the country manager of Engage Squared in Japan. We set up the branch here in Japan just over a year ago, and we're still a pretty small office. We've got 5 people now here. So this is actually a project we ran from kind of December last year through March this year. And the project was building a Power Apps app, working in conjunction with another small consulting firm specializing in training. And the app was to manage kind of career development for a large pharmaceutical firm. And obviously we're based in Japan. The customer is a customer in Japan, and they wanted an app in Japanese. And we have some Power Platform skills in the office in Japan, but more kind of the front end, the requirement gathering and that kind of stuff, and then the actual development, we wanted to leverage our development resources overseas, and we ended up working with a developer based in New Zealand, Ryan, to actually build the app. So as I think you've covered in the case study, the app itself, the UI was all in Japanese, and the developer didn't speak Japanese, which made for some fun points. There you go. That's the app. So this is kind of this app then brings up a bunch of different screens. So each of these boxes kind of brings up a screen. So for example, number one is like, what are you good at? Number two is what's important for you, those kind of things. And then you work through a bunch of questionnaires, and then what are your skills? What are your weaknesses? What do you work on? And you come up with an engagement plan. That's the idea of the app. We didn't define the actual app. We're just building it based on input from the customer. So what we did and how we worked is a guy on my team, Yuta, he was kind of the main contact point, gathering the requirements and making those into user stories. And so we managed that kind of thing using Azure DevOps just as the portal for ticket management. And then the actual back and forth, we worked in an internal team we set up. So it had me and Yuta in Japan, and then Ryan and Ryan's boss in New Zealand. And we just went back and forth in there for the internal discussion. And then we had a separate team with the client in their environment for the kind of back and forth with them. And then with Ryan, he's a developer, he doesn't like talking too much. We had a couple of 20-30 minute syncs a week, and then just did the majority of the work back and forth in chat. And I think there was some comments in the chat, but basically we'd kind of set a new post if there was a specific issue we wanted to talk. We'd file the issue in DevOps just to give it a tracking number, so we were all on the same page. But then rather than going back and forth in there on comments, which is a little bit wieldy because you get an email notification, et cetera, we just do the actual back and forth in Teams with a separate post and then replies. To be honest, Yuta did 90% of the work. So I was just kind of sitting there, and then I could see what was happening in the channel, which made it useful for me if I had to jump in and kind of. There was a few points where the discussion was a little bit tricky for Yuta in English, so I'd jump in and just get Yuta and Ryan on the same page, etc. But it was really easy for me to get context because it was all there in the channel. That's Yuta. Yuta's the guy in the middle behind the computer. You can probably guess which one's me.
And some of this, Michael, so just a day-to-day working. So obviously Ryan's I think he was in Auckland in New Zealand. So he's on one time zone. You guys are in Tokyo. The customer, everything's in Japanese. Ryan doesn't speak Japanese. So I guess talking about collaboration, obviously there was a lot of collaboration for Ryan to be able to create this app in Japanese, a language he doesn't speak. And I think he when we spoke to Ryan too, even using some of the translate options in Teams channels was really helpful. And the asynchronous working, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, the project, I think we had a pretty flexible customer, which was good, but they wanted to really see what we were doing. So we gave them kind of weekly builds or weekly kind of updates of where we're at in development. So we'd kind of, on the Monday, we'd say, roughly on Thursday, we want to show them this. And then, Ryan would give us a build on Wednesday. We kind of check it by close of business, but, please fix these comments. And that would get to Ryan on Thursday morning, and he'd start work at 6 a.m. Japan time, which is already kind of 10 a.m. New Zealand time, not too early. And he'd have all those kind of last minute fixes done in time for the client meeting in the morning on Thursday. So it's quite nice to have someone who's a few hours ahead of you because they can do things before 9 a.m. meetings without having to wake up too early their time. And we just the kind of the small UI points we gave very clear. I mean, we did make an English version of the top page just to help Ryan a little bit. But the actual detailed pages, we just gave him the Japanese and said, put this there, put this there. He did a good job of.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you there. Michael,
No.
can you then walk us through, so once you had the project and then obviously you'd made the decision you were always going to work on in a Teams channel, what does it look like? So take us from the start, setting up that channel and you know how you work in it day to day. Just because I saw in the chat already there's people who would like to move away from chat and start working in channels. So just if you can walk us through what it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, it is very easy to just we had the initial discussion with Ryan and we got on a quick call. Ryan was actually in Bali at the time in December, and then he moved back to New Zealand. And it could have been very easy to just set up a three-way chat and keep going back and forth in a three-way chat, not in a channel. But I think that's not, it's just very easy. Then everything goes down. There's no kind of, topic by topic split. So we made the decision, and you just set up the channel, just to set up a channel with the people who need access to it. And there was only 4 of us, and then we kept all the files in there as well. So all the UI mocks and other documents we kept in there. And then it was nothing more complex than once the channel's up, just using the post feature with a clear heading for each topic. And then it was either a list, a topic per bug, or what we need to get done this week, that kind of level of topic, not too granular, but not too, you don't want to have 150 replies in one topic. So
and so obviously your files were shared in that channel and related to those conversations as well, and you said you had bi-weekly meetings as well, all done within the channel.
Yeah, we just had the 20-30 minute sync a couple of times a week, and the rest was just chat back and forth.
So Michael, this was for one project, which I think only lasted a couple of months or so, or a few months. What happens now that project's finished? You're not using that channel every day. What do you do with that? What does it look like now?
Yeah, I was actually having a look at my teams. So what I do is when project is active, I pin the specific channels within that team. So at the moment, I think I have about 15 channels that are active, and then the rest kind of just sit further down, and I just leave them there. I don't even bother archiving them. There's no real need to archive them as long as they're not making you scroll too much.
Yeah, so that's your way of quietening the noise. Just pin the ones that you're working on day to day. Yeah. Has anyone got questions for Michael? Because, and I'll share the case study in a moment in the chat as well. It's pretty inspiring, working this way, using a different language, different time zones, that sort of thing. But if anyone's got questions for Michael, even down right to the granular, here we go. Are the client channels private channels?
That's a good question. I don't think we actually specifically made it private. We just didn't add anyone else to the team, which is why Stephen and other people couldn't see it. There's no need for it to be private within the company. We do use private channels for sensitive stuff, like HR related and stuff, but generally in Engage Squared, most channels, it's just a question of you need to join it to be able to see it.
Right. Well, if anyone has got questions, just please raise your hand and we'll ask Michael. But I've also just got a quick call to action. So Engage Squared is Microsoft Partner of the Year. And if anyone does need help with adoption for teams and channels, we would highly, highly recommend you get in touch with Engage Squared. There's a link there, which I'll share in the chat as well. But, oh, hang on, here we go from Glynis. Okay, did you create a team per client and chat in the general channel?
Yeah, we created a team per client, and then at least a channel per project. So in this case, we actually had one client and we made 2 versions of the app. So we had 2 different channels. We tend as a rule not to use the general channel, just because if you start in the general channel and you have a complete different topic come up, people get confused what should go on what. But if you never use a general channel, then you're always good because it's clear what the channel is for. That's a general rule we use at Engage Squared.
Michael, I don't know if you know this, but I mean, there is a question there about, is there something formally produced, even by Engage Squared, in the chat versus channels, when to use chat, when to use channels? We do talk about that in the report, and we have written about that, but I'm thinking that maybe Engage Squared might have some some documentation that they share with their clients on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best rule for me is if you're absolutely sure that no one else is going to need this information, you can do it one by one. But if there's a chance other people are going to have a look at it, then put it in a channel, because it's just so much easier for other people to go and view that information.
Now, you know that Microsoft does actually recommend that organizations sort of delete the chat after about a month as a governance thing, and it's because it was never intended for the purpose that many people are using it. You know, in other words, having discussions and sharing knowledge and things like that that really belong in a channel where they can be more persistent. And so, you know, but we also heard with the merger with Virgin Media and O2, backing up or putting all of the chat data, the history of from I don't know how long, you know, is a major issue for them. You know, because it's, as you said in the report, 241 to 1 in terms of the number of messages. Imagine if you're, you know, one of the biggest telcos in Britain and having to sort of take that data across into a new tenant. You know, it was an absolute nightmare. So I think it's the way I think about it is if something that you'd said in the chat disappeared, say, the next week or next month, would it worry you too much? And if it would worry you, then you probably should
a good way
think about putting it
thinking
somewhere else. Yeah.
I don't think you're going to be able to find anything that's more than a month old anyway, unless you're really good at scrolling and searching.
Yeah,
it's so much easier to find posts on the channel, especially if you give them good subject lines.
Yes, and if you think AI is going to save you, I think what you'll find is that if AI trawls through your chat, it'll find when people went to lunch and things like that, rather than really important stuff. So, you know, AI is not a magician. You know, if it can go through structured things, it will come up with a better result than if it goes through a highly unstructured stuff. And the danger of the generation part is if it can't make sense of something, it'll just make it up. So, you know, be aware of that. So the more you can get into that more structured sort of space, the better.
Michael, we've just got another question here. How did you communicate with the client? Was it by email, or did you add the client as a guest to the Teams channel?
Yeah, so the channel I was discussing now was solely our internal channel, and then we actually had a separate channel with the client where we went back and forth in Japanese, and that sat inside their tenant. So they invited us as guest users to their tenants. So we had two.
Interesting.
But we were kind of having separate discussions anyway, so it didn't matter too much.
And in two different languages. That's pretty impressive too.
Yeah. We did see a big increase in the use of guests, so I think organisations are getting more comfortable with that. Now, clearly, the organisations like Engage Squared have been doing this for quite a while, and project type organisations have. But we have seen an uptick quite a lot in the use of guests, and I think that's a good thing. And I think Microsoft is slowly removing the friction in adding guests into your tenants now, or vice versa. So
yeah, we've actually we've got a client where we've done a few projects with them, and every time they send another email with a zip, you know, a zipped up file attached with a password on the zip file, I want to scream, because this is like so 1990s. But one of the projects we're actually doing now is to kind of look at shared channels and teams, and what kind of governance they'd need to set that up in their organization. I mean, they're a subsidiary of a big parent firm that's in the financial industry, so they can't just turn it on willy-nilly, but they at least want to explore that. And I'm like, let's turn it on. We've got to turn it on so we can get rid of these files being sent via email, which is, to me, not very secure anyway. So.
Well, if anyone's got any more questions for Michael, please put them in the chat if you don't mind hanging around and answering them, Michael. And I'm going to hand over to Emily. And Emily's going to think back to that Menti poll at the beginning of this webinar, and remember what you said about how many hours you spend in email, how many hours you spend in meetings, and whether you use Teams channels. And Emily's going to show you exactly what the data tells you, whether what you think is real or what is actually real. So over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Sharon, and thank you, Michael, as well. Great insights. So what I have shared on the screen here is just sort of like a demo view of what SWOOP provides for M365. And this is all coming back to the collaboration habits, the 7 collaboration habits that we talk about quite a lot. And of course, that's sort of the basis of everything that we've measured in the latest report as well. So great to have all of this sort of overall data and to see what those trends look like across the world. But if you were curious to see what this looks like for yourself, or perhaps for your team, or even just to see where your organization fits into the picture, this is where you would be able to tap into some of those more real-time live insights to really understand how you're currently collaborating and your balance of collaboration as well. I think balance is a really key word there. So what we're looking at here, currently I'm just looking at the personal dashboard. So if you can imagine logging in and looking at the way that you're currently using M365, we break down everything by those 7 collaboration habits that we've spoken about. So you'll start to see scores associated with each of those habits just for yourself. So you'd really quickly be able to see the types of habits that you have adopted quite well. If I'm looking at some of these personal habits here, I can see I'm scoring quite high when it comes to email liberation. I can see that I am chat liberated, but on just a quick glance, I could see maybe I have a little bit of work to do when it comes to file sharing and perhaps with camera confidence, which is just simply having my camera turned on in online meetings. But I think for a lot of the conversation that we've had today, and of course some of those really key themes throughout the report, we really can focus in on this email liberated habit. And this is quite simply just looking at that split of how much email you are sending versus how much you're collaborating in Teams channels, and also looking at Viva Engage as well. So if you wanted to see exactly the numbers for yourself, you can then click into this View Insights button. And because this is a relatively high score, this is an extremely strong score, we can see that I'm currently sending less than 1 email for every Teams channel or Viva Engage message. And when we layer in some of those, what good looks like, high performing benchmarks as well, you can see how you then compare to some of those top performers. So for email liberation, we would recommend, if you're sitting at somewhere around the 30 emails sent for every Teams channel or Viva Engage message, that's a really strong score. Now, if you logged in and you looked at some of these insights and it was telling you maybe you're sending 100 emails for every Teams channel or Viva Engage message, you would know at that point, well, I need to adjust some of my habits here. What are the conversations that I'm currently having in email that can be shifted across into Teams or even potentially into Viva Engage? And it doesn't have to be everything. We're not saying don't use email. We're just saying don't only use email. So you could really conservatively even move across, say, 10, 20, 50% of your emails into those asynchronous ways of working. And you would see some really great results as well. Now, if I hide these ones, and we also just have a really quick look at the asynchronous collaborator as well, this is coming into a lot of those meeting habits that we've spoken about today too. So now I can see how many minutes I'm spending in Teams meetings compared to using those asynchronous ways of working, the channels and the Viva Engage messages again. For this example here, again, a score of 88 is pretty strong. If you're looking at this, I can see that I'm spending 37 minutes for every Teams channel or Viva Engage message. But when we look at that benchmark of what good looks like, it's somewhere around that 86 minutes mark. So you can start to compare that and see that in real time. But then you can also, consult some of these things like the insights and tips to see the areas that you need to focus in on a little bit more. But something that we've also found to be quite interesting is looking at this on the segment level too. So you could find those specific parts of your organization that are doing a really good job, or maybe there's a particular habit where they are particularly strong. At the moment, I'm just looking at an example for the IT department. And when I have a scroll through here, that overall collaboration score is quite strong. All of their scores across the board, with the exception of file sharer, look pretty good. But then you might find some really interesting opportunities too. So if I'm looking at the legal department, when I'm jumping in here, they have a little bit of work to do. If I look at their email liberated insights, they're sending 113 emails for every channel message. Asynchronous collaborator, that's a particularly dire looking score there, with over 6,000 minutes in Teams meetings for every Teams channel or Viva Engage message. So that's the areas where they could really go in and focus. But you can also then layer that as well with some of the activity focused insights. So these are the types of things, you know, if you were an administrator, you might be able to see some of these insights across the board. But we also really do believe in delivering these insights to, you know, all the way down to that individual level, so that you can empower yourself to shift those habits. And we've also found those collaboration habits to be a really simple, easy way to reflect and understand the way that you're currently working, so that you can then change the way that you work as well. So if you do have really high numbers against the meetings type metrics, then you can even go in and see what those raw numbers look like too, and even potentially then moving more of those activities and interactions towards sort of the channel insights, and also towards the Yammer or Viva Engage insights as well. I know that there's probably a few people on this session today who currently have access to these insights, which is awesome. So definitely do jump in and see what's happening today. But if you haven't had a chance to have a look at this for your own organisation, please feel free to reach out and let me know. You can run a free trial of SWOOP for M365 and see how things are tracking and see how you compare to those benchmarks. But as a part of this benchmarking study as well that we've released, if you are interested in more of a custom benchmark report for your organisation, if you do run with a trial of SWOOP for M365, then we can also generate a report which will give you a heap more insights too, specific to your organisation. I know that we will have a little bit of dedicated time for Q&A as well in just one moment, but before we do get to that, I just wanted to make sure that everyone had the link to access the report. So Laurie, of course, has gone through some of those key things and findings, but if you want to go through that report in detail, read the case studies, really understand that current state of collaboration globally, this is going to be your go-to report. So of course, you can access this through the SWOOP website. I know the link's been dropped a few times in the chat, but if you have missed out, here's the QR code as well. And I know we have also really been focusing in on M365 and Teams. That's what we typically do at this time of year. But as we start to move into the second half of 2023, we are going to be sort of pivoting our focus towards Viva Engage and SharePoint Intranet. So we have our benchmarking study coming up for these platforms very soon. If you would like to participate, if you would like to really understand how things are tracking in your organisation, to receive a custom report, and even just to see if you do show up as one of the top performers, just as we've spoken with Michael from Engage Squared today, there is a deadline for you to participate. That deadline is the 1st of August. If you're not currently running with SWOOP for Viva Engage or SWOOP for SharePoint, you'll just need to get a free trial up and running. If you're a current customer or if you're currently trialing, all good, you'll be an anonymous participant. But if you are yet to trial SWOOP, or if you're not a current customer, then that deadline that you need to be aware of is the 1st of August. That QR code will just take you to a page on our website to give you a heap of extra information about it. But I'm also here to assist with any questions. Please feel free to reach out to me directly and we can get you set up. Now, I'm not sure if there are a few extra questions coming through in the chat, but for the last 5 minutes or so, we can definitely just take the opportunity to have a bit more of an open discussion. So Sharon, I'm not sure if there was any extra questions, or we can just sort of keep it open for anyone to jump in.
There are so many questions in the chat that I think I've lost track a little bit. So does anyone just want to either jump in and ask their questions, or just raise your hand, or if I've missed anything in the chat? Kim, I saw you had some interesting insight. Oh, there you go. Kim's got a question.
Oh, it's
Do you want to ask
tiny,
it, Kim?
slightly unrelated,
Yeah.
But I was like, I've got this group. I'd love to just ask this really quick one as a little question thrown in there. I was just curious because obviously, you know, we're moving from Yammer to Viva Engage. I feel that Microsoft is doing a pretty good job with how they're communicating that and how they're taking people through that change. So I wasn't planning on doing anything from an internal comms perspective to our people to advise them of the change. I'd love to know, is anybody else doing anything from a comms perspective or feeling the need to really tell people about this?
There's a couple of answers coming in. So
we've
Chris
got
says
we've got
he's
a few
already
campaigns going.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And
That's
thanks for all of the insights from the session. It was fantastic as always.
Interesting what Michael says, that usage of Yammer is shaky at best, and the added complexity of moving to the Viva Engage ecosystem is a concern. It must be pretty tricky for people where it's not strongly used in organisations to then have to switch names and
But I think it's true they've been pretty good with pop-ups and banners and things, and the functionality, is kind of like the same. So it is, and we've already had that sort of bit of, I guess, confusion with what's called communities and teams, and now it's become Engage. I don't know. I think for those of us that are nerds and we care obsessively about this, but I think if you're just someone sitting out there, like the ones that Laurie will call the silent majority, I think it just flushes over them. And it doesn't really, like it's called Viva Engage, whatever. It's the thing I go when I want to ask a question or something. I don't really think that I think maybe some of us get carried away a little bit too much because it means so much to us.
Actually, there's a really interesting case study, I think, in the benchmarking report, and it's about why do we need Microsoft Teams and Viva Engage. And did you? I don't know whether you've read it, Kim. I can see you nodding there.
I skimmed it because I get that all the time. Oh, we don't use Yammer. We don't use Yammer. We don't need Yammer. We don't use Yammer. And it's just that there's not the understanding of the purpose of the different channels. And it's funny. That's why I asked the questions around what frameworks exist for people, because sometimes we've got a lot of engineers, so sometimes they like to have a process flow chart of what you use when versus versus the approach that we all take as internal comms people. We can just go, well, it's about the content and the channel, and then this is how we connect. Well, no, to them, what channel do I use when?
Yeah. Well, I'll share that as a separate story, so it's easier to share. I'll do that in the next week or so. There's a good question here from Deb. Does anyone in the meeting have a set ways of working for Microsoft Teams they use for user adoption? There's actually, sorry, I keep butting in here, but in the benchmarking report, there's actually some other really good examples as well. I'll share one in the chat right now, which was an IT department in the US with a big engineering company, and they made the decision to move from regular working to working in Teams, and it's a bit of a step-by-step guide. So I'll share that now, but I'll leave it over to pass it over to the experts to answer that question.
I recall that there certainly in the benchmarking, VHB were running communities in Teams, and that's I guess that's doable with certain provisos or how you set it up. I must say we prefer to have the Engage or Yammer software used for communities. I was at San Diego with Gartner just a little while ago, and one of their analysts who were known quite a long time was despairing the fact that communities are losing support in the tech space, and even though Yammer hasn't changed, it's still there. A lot of the new Viva Engage things are about internal communications, the telling and the communicating, rather than the community space. So my concern is that we're starting to see that community work sort of start to lose some of that, and in fact, certainly you can do similar things in a big Teams space. So I respect what VHB are doing. That's a choice, but have a look at the Real Foundations case study, and I think there's not the case study. I think it's a piece that Chris Schrader wrote, wasn't it, in the report, which is they're very mature in terms of how they balance this whole Viva Engage versus Teams and so forth, and I think it's worth reading and looking at why they believe that we should still be using Viva Engage for those community things, and it's all about mindset and going to a different place and that sort of stuff. And I think that's very valuable in terms of thinking. I know engineers may not sort of get that in the first sense, but I think it, they're speaking from a very deep experience base.
Deborah's got a really good question in here. Deborah's saying at her current org, neither Teams, assuming this is right, Deborah, Teams nor Viva Engage have been deployed. So you're toying with
neither Yammer nor Engage have been deployed. So there's no.
Oh, right.
So there's Teams and chat and all of that, but we're just building a big new knowledge center in SharePoint, and I'm thinking about how to do that first pass of expertise location before in the coming years we can get to Viva Topics and all the rest of it. So I'm thinking about deploying it just as an engine in under the pages. It's a very, middle of the night thought at the moment.
Deb, I mean, have the IT people talk to the Gartner people, because really, they were pretty much saying some of these IT people have shut the Microsoft stuff down so far that some of their clients, their customers are actually going out looking for other technologies because they didn't think that Microsoft could do it, and it wasn't the case. It was because their IT departments that actually shut down functions.
Oh yeah, no, they that's been a concerted friendship bridge building campaign of mine for the past 10 months, and we're in a good place, but now they're tied up with a really big Dynamics 365 implementation. So I'm just until we circle back around to this sort of stuff again, I'm thinking about, there's some value in if that sort of model would work. It would be light touch for them, and we would learn a lot before we went out to then try and deploy a bigger communities engaged type operation. We would have people getting used to asking questions in a forum like way via the knowledge that they're accessing. It's just an idea. I just wondered if anyone had gone down that path or had experience with that.
Claudia, I think, might be on the call. You might be able to answer that, Claudia. I saw she was in the chat earlier.
Maybe she's gone.
Might have gone. Yeah.
Thanks anyway. I didn't mean to hijack.
But Deborah, Engage Squared could be really helpful with stuff like that as well. If you want to just reach out, Michael, that'd be the right sort of. You guys do that sort of stuff, don't you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, there is, shutting it down too much. That's really shutting down the value opportunity quite a lot. So I think and I can understand it from the governance point of view from IT, but certainly Gartner, who advise the IT functions, are saying, they've gone too far. They're saying, look, so they're getting, backroom people buying, what do they call it? They've got a name for it, just buying other software because they didn't think Microsoft could do things, and it was really because.
That won't be the
case with you. Well, that's good news. It horrified me, and it certainly was the case. There was certainly the case with many organisations.
It was just that typical sort of reaction. But what I'm thinking about, because we don't have anything of those things available yet, and it's not for them to turn on. There'll be a campaign to deploy them. So I'm just thinking as an earlier piece, this idea of leveraging Engage to plug in that way. Anyway, I don't want to take away from this.
There was an interesting question from Romani about strengthening the partnership with between, I guess, internal comms and IT, and that's an issue I hear about quite often, and it comes to this, that IT can be the blocker for good reasons, like from security. There are other reasons why it's gone through, like I think you're in the financial sort of services area. And and that can be government regulation of things that prevents people from operating a particular way. I know Syngenta, they did something. It's a big Swiss agri-tech business. They had someone from IT, from internal comms, basically sitting up the floor with IT. They sort of swap places to learn to build more relationships, because you do think people think differently. I mean, I know that. So we have an engineer, we have a software company, and I know that these software engineers just think and work differently than those of us that are, customer focused or customer more outward focused.
they have to build trust in you over time. And one of the things that's worked for me is using the comms and information architecture to solve problems for them. So the usual thing, Romany, that I lead with is, okay, I've got control of internal websites and things like that. Where is your information? How can I help you save numbers on tickets? And I work with them to put a lot of IT presence into the world of work, and it makes them look good. It builds their trust in me, and then we can do things like work on Active Directory profiles and all sorts of good stuff. So, yeah.
And I like Michael's advice.
That too.
Great. If there are any other final questions, or if anyone wants to jump in and have a chat, I'll probably just pause the recording and everything at this point. You're welcome to hang around. But otherwise, I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Thank you for joining us. And we'll be in touch so that you can access the recording and the content from today as well. So thanks, everyone.
And Michael, thank you so much for joining us from Tokyo.
No problem.
Thanks, Michael.
For having me.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you, everyone.